Hey guys, just wanted to do a little video intro to the biology, the biological, and kind of pubertal development chapter. So this chapter on Canvas also has audio with it. So I'm not going to talk too much about this chapter, but I'm just going to give you a few highlights. So one thing to be aware of with this chapter is that it's not just about kind of the sexual maturation, but it's also about the physical maturation, right? So it's not just about males being able to produce sperm that pack a punch, for lack of a better term, and females being able to release eggs from their ovaries. It's also, physical growth, getting taller, changes in respiratory and pulmonary capacity, changes in body composition. Like males, as a function of going through puberty, have a higher muscle to fat ratio as opposed to females who have a more equivalent fat to muscle ratio. And so what makes puberty a little bit more difficult for females as a whole is that a lot of the kind of natural processes that are biologically, seemingly make sense and evolutionarily make sense, right? So biologically it makes sense that we'd have higher fat content if we're going to, have children, be able to grow them, literally feed them, take care of them. It makes more sense that we're going to have a higher fat composition compared to males. And again, evolutionarily, males are the ones who are maybe out hunting and gathering and doing all those other macho things. But as a society, what we see in terms of, idealized body images are really in contrast to what's happening biologically and what should be happening. And so sometimes what's happening, particularly with females, is that, they're kind of what their body is not going to measure up to kind of what is shown on the media. And, the media is, as we know, photoshopped and surgically developed and kind of impossible to meet some of those standards. So that kind of lends itself to feelings of depression, inadequacy, anxiety in females. And so that's a problem. And not to say that males don't have some challenges, but what I think some of what's happening as a function of going through puberty for males is more consistent with what, again, and I'm not condoning this necessarily, but what is more of the idealized body image for males, which is a more muscular physique. And so there's some inherent challenges there. Some other issues that make it harder for females overall with respect to pubertal development is the fact that you should see it in the slide where it talks about how the fact that females tend to mature on average about 2 years ahead of males. And that's quite significant. I think, again, growing up as a kid, that was not something I was aware of at all. I kind of noticed, hey, maybe I was taller than those boys in 6th or 7th grade, and I kind of peaked in 6th or 7th grade in terms of my height, and I kind of just stayed there. But I think, when females, this process of like physical maturation, sexual maturation, it's something that people can physically see. And so for females who are maturing earlier, on average 2 years, and it's something that people can see, as you know, being an adolescent yourself at one point, being different for something like that is not always easy or good to do. So, the first girl who maybe matures and we start noticing that as a class in 4th or 5th grade, it might be a real challenge for that individual. So kind of there's a theory that talks about this. It's called the maturational deviance hypothesis. And so what that's saying is not only are they maturing earlier, so what's really challenging, let me back up a little bit. What's really challenging is especially for those girls that are early maturing girls. So what the literature has shown is that not only is it a little bit harder in general for females going through puberty, it's much harder to be an early mature, and there's a couple negative outcomes associated with that. A lot of depression, anxiety, what they call precocious sexual activity, precocious like behavioral like engaging in some like at-risk behaviors, like maybe drinking, precocious drug and alcohol use, things like that. Because what's happening is that not only are they developing before all the guys. Because they're early developers, they're developing before the girls. And so it's that much more deviant in the sense of deviant from the norm. So that makes it really hard. If you're being the first, or one of the first girls to mature, you're the first girl among the girls, and definitely the first mature among the males. So that's hard. And then the other thing is, another theory that kind of complements that is called the developmental readiness hypothesis. So what that is saying is that, listen, yes, they're maturing physically earlier than males. And there's some evidence in a lot of ways that females mature a little bit faster emotionally than males. But when you're an early maturer with respect to your, period, and respect to, gonadarchy and adrenarchy, a lot of these emotions that are accompanying those things, right? So maybe feeling more moody, more irritable, more, cortisol starts jumping on board, so we're more reactive to stress, also as a function of going through puberty. So a lot of these emotional things are going on in concert with this sexual maturation, and so, or biological maturation, and so they're not like completely emotionally ready. So remember from that first, my kind of introductory set of slides, the first PowerPoint, a lot of these changes are happening, and they're not necessarily happening in the best or correct order, if there is such a thing as best or correct order. So if a girl is maturing physically much, much earlier, the odds of her being caught up cognitively, emotionally, or from a coping perspective are unlikely to be caught up. And so trying to manage all of this stuff, like being different from everybody else, having more emotions secondary to hormones and other things and cortisol and whatnot, it makes the whole process less likely to be a smooth, easy transition, if that makes sense. So there's that maturational deviance hypothesis and the emotional readiness hypothesis that kind of work together, that says, gosh, being an early mature for a female is really, really hard. Okay. Let's see, some other things that I wanted to just make sure you understood is, obviously you're getting a sense from the notes that the HPG axis is kind of what's getting initiated with respect to starting puberty. We don't have a great understanding of exactly what initiates it. We understand some things, and really what's happening is that it's truly this interesting combination of nature and nurture. So perhaps biologically and / genetically, given, assuming that, maybe siblings or something, say you have, you're one of 5 sisters, God forbid, or wonderful for you, you're one of 5 sisters, and assuming that you all have a pretty similar environmental situation, given that you share some of the same genetic background and you maybe share your environment, you may be likely to start your periods at a similar time period, right? So maybe you all would be somewhere around, 11 or 12 or something, as an example. But like I said, it's very much a function of both nature and nurture. So the environment can really come in there and kind of rear its ugly head and impact what biology has kind of set. So again, it's hard to say sometimes exactly what starts puberty. We know it's a hypothalamus as part of the HPG. The hypothalamus kind of gets initiated and starts communicating with the pituitary and kind of sets a lot of this kind of hormonal feedback loop into motion, as you can see on the slides. And so it acts via the androgens like testosterone and estrogen and kind of feeds it back to the hypothalamus and says, do we need to make more? Do we need to kind of slow down this kind of process? But what I mean is, so let's go back to those random 5 sisters that I mentioned. So pretend that one of them was raised maybe in a very impoverished setting with a lot of maybe poor nutrition or not consistent vaccinations, had a lot of illnesses. Some of those kinds of things can perhaps delay puberty, right? Similarly, say we had another sister that was adopted and she became a Olympic gymnast, and she overexercised and, had like no fat on her body. And so sometimes like having no fat, one of the best, like actual most consistent predictors that we found in terms of initiating puberty, the whole process, is actually fat content. So this is measured oftentimes via it's a protein in fats called leptin. And it's thought, the concentration of that, having enough of this kind of fat content, you need enough fat to be able to kind of initiate your menstruation. And again, that makes a lot of sense given the fact that if you're malnourished or you're over exercising or something is going wrong or you're really ill, that your body is kind of, in essence, has this kind of safety net to say, listen, you're not doing a great job in some ways of keeping yourself kind of healthy and managed, so there's no way that you're ready to have a child. So it kind of shuts down that kind of process. So it could either stop the initiation of menstruation and pubertal development, or maybe if you've developed and started your maturation that way, as you guys have probably heard in cases of eating disorders or other things like that, some individuals will have what's called amenorrhea, where their menstruation would stop. So the point being that there's lots of interesting factors externally that can contribute to the onset or the, non-progression of the pubertal development. So other things that I mentioned here that I guess I want to explain a little bit better. One of them's a little bit creepy, I guess. One will say too, being, it's called I have it on the slide that says the presence of mature sexual partners, typically of a non-biological nature. So living in close proximity in the case of females, living in close proximity to a non-biological relative can also initiate a little bit earlier the onset of menstruation and this kind of biological development. So basically, again, it's kind of this evolutionary thought that the goal of pubertal development is to be able to sexually reproduce. And so having an awareness, so sometimes they'll say individuals or girls who have a stepfather or a stepbrother that they live with who's non-biologically related to them, that would trigger puberty based on pheromones more than would someone who is biologically related to them, because again, beyond things I completely comprehend, somehow at the pheromone, this, subconscious level, we're aware of like, hey, I shouldn't and won't reproduce with my biological relative because that would lead to a lot of genetic challenges, but it's kind of gross. So I should just stop there while I'm ahead, frankly. Let's see. One thing I feel like adrenarche is kind of just underappreciated and undervalued. So that will be my public service announcement, but adrenarche is really like the kind of setting gonadarche, kind of laying the foundations for it. So if some of you have little brothers especially, or sisters, but especially brothers, they smell, right? Like when they're like 9, 10, they start to stink. That's adrenarche. So it's changes in their sweat compositions. Adrenarche is referring to maturation of the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is a little fatty party hat on top of your kidney that produces cortisol, amongst other things. And so it's kind of like the ugly part of puberty, like the worst part, right? So you're getting smelly, it's kind of helping promote like acne, because like the kind of sweat composition is changing, and pubic hair, like, ugh. Usually in class I make you guys like say aloud the word pubic hair and vagina and period, but you're lucky you don't have to, because I could tell you to do it, but you won't. So it's kind of funny. Last thing, because I only think I have 15 minutes, to tell you guys another huge part of what's happening that no one talks about is the fact that, not that no one talks about, but as a function of puberty, another thing that's happening is that melatonin secretion is happening later. So melatonin is the hormone that is responsible for kind of initiation of like, I'm getting tired, it's time to go to bed, that kind of thing. And it gets delayed on average about 1 to 2 hours later as a function of going through puberty. So it's called the delays phase preference. So teenagers are not just being jerks because they don't want to go to bed or listen to their parents. They are biologically not tired. So imagine if I told you guys right now that I think that your ideal bedtime would be 8 o'clock. It's really hard to make yourself go to bed at 8 o'clock when you're like just not having those like sleep signals to want to go to bed regularly at 8 o'clock. I'm sure after finals that sounds great. But that affects a lot, and the fact that teens aren't getting enough sleep also affects their mood. It's